Musical Truth, Volume 2.
This is my church. God is a DJ.
They call me arrogant, cause I speak when it's a room full of elephants.
Some say man ain't happy unless man truly dies.
Well, maybe we should all be praying for time.
Oh, don't be fooled by what you see. Don't be fooled by what you hear.
Man, you've been a naughty boy, you let your face grow long.
Then I'll get on my knees and pray we don't get fooled again.
Musical Truth Volume 2 by Mark Devlin is available now on Amazon and via musicaltruthbook.com.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night.
Good vibrations.
Welcome to Good Vibrations episode 126. Today's is a returning guest. You might have heard him at the start of the year. He goes by the name of Charlie Freek. We'll ask him about that. I think that comes from Steely Dan. And he is a dude that has undertaken a pretty monumental task. He's got a book series called Lightning in a Bottle, a book series on the most important rock albums in music history. I think he's done in excess of 150 essays on these very important albums. And he's interested in the same thing as me, which is meaningful message music, which has something powerful to impart to humanity. And so we had a good conversation about this the first time round. If you want to get the concept and the backstory behind the book series and why he decided to do it, I would recommend you go back and listen to that particular podcast to set the scene, because today we're just going to take up the conversation with 6 more albums from that series, and we're going to get Charlie to run through each one and explain what he likes so much about it and what important messages he feels are being conveyed through the music. So we're crossing over to Mexico and welcoming back Charlie Freek. Welcome back, man.
Hey, thanks very much, Mark. A great pleasure to be back on the Mark Devlin podcast, Good Vibrations.
All right, so just fill us in quickly on where this Charlie Freek name comes from, because I don't believe that's your birth name, right?
No. You and I discussed this before. The birth names that each of us have are essentially slave names. We have no input into it at all. So first name, middle name, last name, we come with a birth certificate number, all these things to take away the grandeur, the magic, the miracle of the individual. So when we were going through this process of deep down the rabbit hole and then way back up through a spiritual awakening, it was pretty clear that we needed a fresh set of names. So Charlie Freek does come from the Steely Dan album Pretzel Logic and the song Charlie Freek. It is a name that really ties in the best of Frank Zappa, Steely Dan, these great artists who really did care, gave a shit about what was going on and about the essence to the movement for change, which really were after World War II, were the freaks born out of the 50s before, of course, they were overhauled, and then that was turned into the hippies and they were overhauled, and that turned into the massive malaise and boredom that we have today. So Charlie Freek is a name that encapsulates truth and integrity, honesty, tenacity for the truth, and an unwillingness to comply with the system. So that's the best thing about it. Freek is non-compliance.
All right. So we've got 6 more albums to get into today, and I just want to preface this by saying that I'm well aware that some of the names we're going to be discussing have had lots of questions asked about them. Probably I've asked some of the questions myself. We had this conversation last time about how we are conscious of the fact that some of these artists have backgrounds and affiliations and are obviously connected to the industry machine in a big way. And that's pretty much another conversation for another day. What we're talking about here is specifically the music output, and we're taking it at face value and examining these songs and what they've got to impart by way of their message. So before anyone starts screaming, don't you realise this artist is dirty, don't you realise this artist is CIA or whatever, yes we do, and we've had many conversations like that, but today we're just going about it in a slightly different way, just by way of a disclaimer. Just to kick things off, the first one we've selected is Bruce Springsteen, Born to Run, 1975. So say what you'd like to about that. We've got about 10 minutes on it, and just preface it by your response to my statement there.
Yeah, really quickly, again, folks, we live in a reality of this and that, and it isn't this or that. So what's been happening within the truth movement is all of this realization that people who are in these various industries have had to play the game, and it's really as simple as that. Some play it more so than others, some less, but it is an industry, and they have rules, and people follow those rules. Basically, what's really important for me to state here, and for I think the listeners to understand, is this. During the late 50s, when rock and roll was expanding at an enormous rate, faster than they had anticipated and could control, floodgates were open through the late 50s, early mid-60s, and there were literally tens of thousands of artists that were allowed in to the industry, and they didn't have any kind of familial control over these individuals. They just brought them in, and the method of control was typically through the record contract, especially that first contract that destroyed lives and stole the rights to music and forced these genius artists to live off of pennies because the record companies were taking all the royalties. So that's the reality. And then this is why in especially the music industry you have levels. So you have stars and superstars and then megastars. And those that became stars, if they wanted to go any further, then they had to play the game. So this is my contention in the book series, that these albums, these artists are not a bunch of devil worshippers. They're kids that were brilliant, and they wanted to create something very special and set it out there for the world to enjoy. And this is essentially where you find Bruce Springsteen in 1975. He actually went into the studio in 74 after the Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle. And, you know, his first two records were very Bruce Springsteen-ish, and they didn't really capture a large market, or more so a regional market. And so typical, the record label put massive pressure on this kid and said that we're going to give you a larger recording budget. I think it was in the neighborhood of $500,000. And they said, go into the studio, and this is your last chance, which is a theme that plays out throughout the album on many songs. This is your last chance to make a hit record. And so Bruce Springsteen compromised on a few things, and that's what he did. So he went into the studio with enormous pressure on his shoulder, like all these kids are faced with, and he hit a home run. And the thing most that I wanted to say, and this hopefully will lead you into the conversation as well, Mark, is one of the biggest things that most Springsteen fans don't recognize about the boss, Bruce, is that he was actually and is a very spiritual person, and did a lot of meditation. And the Born to Run album, so much of it is actually being spoken from within. These are essentially manifestations of his imagination, of his meditation, and then he's taking those experiences and applying them to sort of real life situations. And so you've got this host of Springsteen followers from the swamps of Jersey and all over America and the world, and they tend to see Bruce as just a very physical world, loves his cars, kind of a man's man kind of thing. And that's not the heart of Bruce Springsteen. He was a very, very thoughtful, spiritual individual. And these songs are a representation of him inside trying to find his personal freedom. And that's what every single song is about. And he applies them to various characters and various aspects of his own family situation, in particular the relationship he had with his dad. And each song, and this is the stipulation, folks, so that you understand when you purchase any of the books in this series. Every single album in this series of 150 most important albums, every song has to be an absolute fantastic creation. There is no allowance for hit and miss. So that's why, if you're looking at these albums and looking at why there's, say, 70 different artists for 150 albums, it's because a very small group of individuals ever achieved this level of excellence, an uncompromising excellence to every single detail over their songs and, of course, the album. And that's what you have with Born to Run. It is a stunning creation. It is extremely important because all of these songs are talking about the true importance of finding oneself inside and being yourself no matter what anybody else thinks or wants to critique. You've got to be you. And that's what the album is. So if you want to jump in for a sec on a few thoughts, that'd be great.
All right, well, I don't know much about Bruce Springsteen. I don't know a whole lot about this album, but obviously it's the title track that sticks in my mind. And the thing I love about the title track is the lyrics. It's just incredibly incisive lyrics, and he would have been quite a young dude when he penned those, still in his 20s, I guess. And really it just speaks to being young, the youthful experience.
Yes.
The freedom of youth before you get bogged down with all the responsibilities that come in later life of family and work and commitments and stuff. It's just free-spirited youth, kids huddled on a beach in a mist and highways jammed with broken heroes on a last chance power drive and all this stuff. Really poetic lyrics, but just about being young, which you remember being young, Charlie?
Yeah, that's right. But on the surface, that of course is sort of a general message that a lot of people pull from Born to Run, that it is about capturing the spirit and the essence of youth. But it's so much deeper than that, because the essence and the spirit of youth is truth. And that's all there really is in this world. Mark, we've talked about this a little bit, and especially in our recent podcast, which will be released in a couple of days on my show. And it's a phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal podcast. You were on fire. We talked about it a little bit, but the fact is, folks, that the only thing that really exists is truth. We live in a reality right now where everything has been spun into the word information, and there is no such thing as information. Information's a general concept, but it's not an actual thing. Truth is a thing. And if it's not the truth, then it's the untruth or a lie. And this is, I think, another aspect of why these records are so important, why these books are so well written and so very important to get a copy of and to read, because what sits on these albums and within the books is the truth. And again, if it isn't the truth, it's a lie. And Springsteen is talking on the album through his inner meditation, his inner experiences through searching and seeking within himself about trying to be able to play out his life in a way that is authentic to himself. And the general theme of this continues to his follow-up album.
Let's move on to the next album. You mentioned Bruce Springsteen's spiritual side. There was a spiritual essence to him which people don't always pick up on, and that kind of segues into this next dude who is very much celebrated for his spiritual input into his music and that side of his persona, which is George Harrison. And you've selected the album All Things Must Pass, 1970, directly after the Beatles split. What do you want to tell us about this one?
Yeah, it's a very important album. There's 2 George albums on our 150, and All Things Must Pass, as you said, is the one that followed out of the Beatles, and a lot of people attribute it to the egos of Paul and John preventing more of George's songs getting on these records. But I tend to think through my research that it was more Sir Paul McCartney that was keeping a lot of George works off of the records and limiting him down to 1 or 2 tracks. So there's a huge amount of material here, and obviously the quality of the music is top notch. George had his friends on the album, and these are some of the finest players in the world, of course, such as Eric Clapton on guitar, Gary Wright on the keyboards, his great friend Klaus Voormann on bass, Jim Gordon on drums. I think Ringo played on a few tracks, but it was predominantly Jim Gordon. And you just go across the whole list, and it's just phenomenal artist after phenomenal artist, instead of, just the Beatles doing these things. So the melodic complexity of the songs were fantastic. The performances of the songs were great, but it really comes down to the lyrical messages on the album, and they were stunning. And there's a little bit of the sentiment about the breakup of the Beatles in there, for sure. But again, typical with George, that sentiment plays out through "Isn't It a Pity?" And of course, that song is relevant on a whole number of levels, far beyond just the Beatles. But it does speak a little to the fact that it's a pity that 4 kids were not able to just be authentic, be themselves, get along, and make music that so many seem to enjoy. The first song on the album, I'd Have You Anytime, which actually Harrison reached out to Bob Dylan, who had a really strained relationship with the various Beatles, largely due to egos getting in the way. And George reached out to Bob as a friend and actually got Bob to help co-write the song. And it's a beautiful track, just about accepting Dylan for who he was, regardless of what he may or may not have agreed to do or get into. And it led to a lifelong friendship. It's a very beautiful thing. My Sweet Lord, extremely important, because it is true, no matter how much people like to deride things that sound so simple and so nice, as if you chant the name of the Lord, you will be free. It's true. This is all about an electromagnetic ether that we live within, so everything is vibration. Therefore, the words that we choose to utilize in the moment have a powerful incantation on ourselves and others. So, My Sweet Lord, and the fact that it became like a #1 hit is a staggering thing, because here's such an incredibly simple and powerful message that was reaching tens of millions of people, and all across this perfect earth.
Let me just cut in there, Charlie, regarding that track, because I know that George pissed off a whole bunch of Christians with that record, because they thought when it starts out talking about My Sweet Lord, it's an ode to, the Christian God, and you start singing along with it and you find yourself getting caught up with the catchy hook, and then about midway through it replaces the lyric My Sweet Lord Hallelujah with Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare, and you realise that actually it's become an ode to Hinduism. And George himself in interviews said, yeah, I did that deliberately. I wanted to pull people in and kind of subliminally drop this on them and get them off their guard, and he was being quite mischievous about it in the statements that he made. What do you make of that whole thing and his whole approach to that particular song?
Well, I know you know this, and the real reason for George doing that is to get this incredibly important message out there to everyone that there is one God. And all it is, folks, you just need to the answer is always so simple. When it's the truth, it really is. And the simple answer is that there is a God, and that the information about our God is disseminated through all these different groups of people or cultures across this earth. And so we all interpret it a different way. But the fact is, Krishna, and that's why Krishna has the exact same birth story as Jesus Christ, because it's all the same thing. It's all astrological in its storyology, and so they're all the same. All of the different gods that people have and pray to is just their name or their particular cultural aesthetics towards that one same God. That's it. And so for George, it was so important to have a track that's speaking to My Sweet Lord and understanding that it's everyone's sweet Lord, and he comes in different names because of course we're all different. Every single culture is different. It was so important. And that's why George is saying in the song, it doesn't matter which name it is that you use, and that's why he uses so many different names within the song, as long as you're chanting the name of the Lord, you are resonating powerfully within the electromagnetic ether, this vibration of love and this request for love.
You're giving it up for the God of creation, but people just put different names on it, would be the idea. And I was listening to an interview with our good friend, our mutual friend Mike Williams, who was doing a show with Kevin Martin on Mind the Gap recently, and Mike had been invited to select a movie to talk about, and he selected George Harrison's Living in the Material World. And during the course of the conversation, he was talking about this horrific knife attack that George had on him at his home in Friar Park near Henley-on-Thames in December 1999, when this assailant broke in and George got badly stabbed up on the stairs, and this guy was clearly trying to kill him, and it's a miracle he survived actually, although he only lived another couple of years after that and died late 2001. But Mike was recounting interviews that George gave after the event where he said he was convinced he was about to die, and he was actually preparing to pass over. He was thinking to himself, this is the moment where I'm going to leave this realm of existence and go on to the afterlife, and I want to be ready for it. I want to be spiritually prepared. And how many people have thoughts like that going through their head when they're being viciously stabbed? But this guy wanted to make sure his transition was going to be a smooth and worthy one. I thought that was quite an incredible story.
It is, and it's true as well. And you ask, what kind of person does that? It's a person that devotes their life to balance, and balance is this recognition, and this is bringing Mike Williams back in. Mike coined this wonderful expression, two halves of the football field, two 50-yard halves, and that basically 99% of the Western population, for sure, only believe in a physical reality, and they kind of give sort of off the cuff, sort of a treatment to spirituality, but they mostly write it off. And unless we embrace the fact that we exist simultaneously within two worlds, then we are only living half of our existence. And we can't even come close to understanding who we are, what we like, what we're here for. None of this is apparent because we're only living in one aspect, which is the physical realm. So George's ability to prepare himself for transition and not be in fear of dying is actually a track on the album called Art of Dying. And he goes into this detail about preparing yourself for what comes next. And George believed, I believe, I would think that you believe as well, that we do not live in a reality where God forces things upon us. You talked about this so beautifully in our podcast.
Yeah.
There isn't a God that says do this or else.
Yeah.
We're gifted with free will. So
it's consenting.
That's right. So if you want to continue this merry-go-round of reawakening into the form of a child and remembering nothing and being used as a tool for a small group of sick people every time around this little ride that we have, then you're a victim, and God didn't create victims. We are infinite, amazing, powerful creations, and all we need to do is recognize it. So by George embracing the spiritual aspect of himself, by meditating daily, by making it a huge part of his life, he was completely aware that even though he's being stabbed and potentially to physical death, he's not going to die. He's transitioning. He's preparing himself to transition. And here's something very important for all of you to understand, and I go into great detail in the book about it, and that is that George did not want to return as a child. He wanted to stay within the non-physical and choose to come back as kind of a drop-in upon, his own choosing. But he did not want to go through this again. And obviously, I think we have a pretty strong reason as to why, when you look into any kind of truthful understanding of what the Beatles were all about and what those poor kids were asked to do.
Can't fault him on that decision, for sure.
Exactly.
One thing you do hear is that when spirits appear to people, or what people would call ghosts, when you do a bit of delving into their back history, you often find that these were people that died very sudden and traumatic deaths. They had no preparation for it. 1 minute they're in this world, the next minute they've been taken from it and they don't know what's happened. And they're trying to come to terms with their death, which is why they kind of linger around, or they're in some sort of no man's land between this world and the next. So the manner of your death and whether you've been able to prepare for it seems to have a bearing on what does happen to you afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great point. I believe that very much because it is free will. Free will doesn't end the moment that this physical form passes. Free will is eternal. So it makes perfect sense. And here's another great point for all the listeners, Mark, to understand as well. When the news came out to George that John Lennon had been shot, and I don't think that George knew in that instant whether he was dead or alive, but the first thing that George said publicly is that he worried that because John was attacked in such a violent way, that he would remember his art of dying, that he would remember the mantra that he and George had worked on together for John's transition. John was also someone who did not want to go back and do this as an unknowing child again.
Yeah.
So George worked with John Lennon, very much so, to prepare him with a mantra, which isn't a word. A mantra is a song of your existence, and so John had his mantra, and it was important. George was concerned that John had the presence of mind in that moment to remember his mantra and just focus and repeat his mantra.
And do you know what that mantra was?
No, I don't know what his personal mantra was.
Okay. Well, no worries. Let's keep it cracking on anyway. I mean, that must have been playing on George's mind, that whole experience when he was going through his own situation. But anyway, the next album we wanted to talk about was Earth, Wind and Fire, That's the Way of the World, 1975. When I first started on the path to the research that I'm doing now, I got into all this symbolism that crops up on record sleeves and in music videos and stuff, and you see the same old signs and symbols, and a lot of people alerted me to some Earth, Wind and Fire albums where you find things like pyramids and Egyptian ankhs and all kinds of mystical and metaphysical symbology. And at first, the temptation was to think, oh, well, they're part of this agenda, you know, they're flashing up all these Illuminati symbols and stuff. But when you get a bit deeper into the research and you kind of mature in your viewpoint on it, you realise that, of course, symbols are neutral in their base state. They're not evil inherently. And bands could well be using symbols for uplifting and benevolent purposes rather than for mind control. And I think that's certainly the case with Earth, Wind and Fire. But let's get your take on it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this is why it's so important for both of our listeners out there to understand and follow Marty Leeds. Marty is a gentleman who's been relatively quietly putting forth, like yourself, some of the most important information that truly exists. It's truth. I say that dirty word information, but there's truth or lies. And Marty, like yourself, is disseminating truth. And it's very, very important truth. And that's what Marty is showing us through his gematria. And that is that all of this symbology is based on sacred geometry, and sacred geometry is encoded by God through Mother Nature, our sacred feminine mother, and that's the Holy Trinity. So there's our Heavenly Father up in the sky, which is unreachable, untouchable, unknowing, so that tells us it's a non-physical experience. There's Mother Earth, who's care, compassion, and love, and she's very touchable. She's here, present with us, three-dimensional on Earth, our sacred feminine. And then we exist in the moment as a miracle creation that makes this yin and yang transform itself into this incredible individual experience. So we individuals are not just some accident of the cosmos, an uncaring Big Bang load of bullshit. We are the creations of a Heavenly Father, a sacred feminine mother, and this is essentially what Earth, Wind, and Fire wrote about on every single one of their albums. They talked, no one did a better job of talking about this holy trinity between the Heavenly Father, the sacred feminine mother, and the individual. And this is why, Mark, Flat Earth is so important. Let's work Flat Earth into our discussion on...
Oh, there goes half the listenership.
Oh gosh, get back here! Come on.
See you guys.
It's just the truth. Don't worry about it. It's only the truth. The great thing about Flat Earth is that through our physical senses, it teaches us that everything is at eye level, and that essentially everything is level. I mean, obviously the greatest giveaway that the Earth is flat is the fact that water doesn't curve. It's flat. And this is why we measure everything. Everything that we do from our architectural or engineering standpoint is all based upon sea level and whether it's level or not. And we measure level on water, because water is always level. And when we look, our vision of perspective always runs to a vanishing point on the horizon. And that horizon just coincidentally just happens to be at the midpoint or the center between what's up and what's below. It always is. It always is. And this is telling us the truth of our reality, that everything is about level. And therefore, the purpose to life is very much about finding level. And what is level? It's balance. And what does balance provide us? Harmony. And what does harmony create? Happiness. And it's only when we find level that we can truly become happy. And it's under that construct that we begin to discover who the hell we actually are, what it is that we actually like, and begin to live an authentic life. So if any of this is resonating with you, buy an Earth, Wind and Fire album. Every single album was talking about this particular subject matter. And Maurice White passed a number of years ago, but I just wonder, had Maurice stayed a little longer, if he had been maybe one of the actual celebrities that would have come out and embraced flat Earth, because I think very much he, at the very least, knew it. And this is what you're finding within all Earth, Wind and Fire records. And again, bringing Marty Leeds back into it, all of the symbology that is being used is beautiful. Everything is created, or the ability to create is through God's creation. So there is no bad. There's just people who use it for dark things. And so now, because we've allowed ourselves to be ruled over by a small group of sick fucks, they choose to use certain symbology, and now it's tainting in our eyes these incredible creations. So like you mentioned, the pyramid. Really quickly here, we'll end Earth, Wind and Fire because they talk about this as well. Why is it so important? Why did they use it so much? Why do those that rule over us use the pyramid so much? It's the squaring of the circle. When you attempt to take these two geometric shapes and make them equal, you can't. There's always a little bit left over. And that little bit of space that's left over is the capstone. So what's missing from the Great Pyramids? The capstone. Where is it? We don't know. I don't know. Probably worthless, I think the capstone to the Great Pyramids was actually like a Rosetta Stone that was able to decode all the truth and information that's in the electromagnetic ether, and allowing us to download into our minds instantaneously all of this information that just simply exists, all this truth that exists. And that's why it's missing. But the squaring of the circle always leaves behind this proportionate space that is the capstone to the Great Pyramids. And just out of coincidence, folks, this is why they have the moon a certain size, a certain distance away from the Earth in relation to the distance of the sun away from the Earth, because proportionately to them and their little story about space, the moon is the capstone. It is the exact proportionate dimension of the capstone on the Great Pyramid. It's called squaring of the circle. And if you want to get into more detail about what this sacred geometrical exercise was all about and why it's so important, just check out Marty Leeds on Marty's channel. Marty's actually just creating his own website, and he's transferring all his information over to his own website, Marty Leeds 33, because he's been shut down on YouTube so many times. Why? Because he's telling the truth.
Right. Well, that was a trip.
Yep.
Let's move on. Next album we've got is Tears for Fears. So we're into the 80s. This is the only album from this selection coming from the 80s. Tears for Fears, a band from Bath, England. The two principal members, Roland Orzabal and Kurt Smith, had a bit of a falling out, if I recall, and was sort of estranged for years. Then I think they came back together. Wouldn't be the first time a band has fallen out, the key members, and gone their separate ways. Seems to be an unavoidable aspect of the creative process when you have two very creative individuals trying to work together, and it doesn't always work out too well. Tears for Fears, a lot of people I think would have memories of them as a synth pop band basically, and they put them in the same category as Duran Duran, as Spandau Ballet and OMD and Human League and bands like that. But I think what you're going to say is that there was a lot more to them lyrically when you actually look at some of their songs from Mad World 1982, which is the one that put them on the map. There's some heavy lyricism there, and their songs did seem to carry some messages, but I'll leave you to fill in the rest about this group.
Thank you. I'm very partial to what people call Tears for Fears. But Roland Orzabal was the heart and soul of Tears for Fears. Roland, I think for many reasons, felt more comfortable, stronger as part of a band and not as a solo artist. But, the falling out that Roland and Kurt had was that to Roland, this was his reason for existence. This was his life. He took it so seriously, and this is why the Tears for Fears albums are also great, even when they started in a more sort of electronic type, Spandau Ballet type music. He took every single note so seriously, every single word so seriously, and he just grew as an artist. And Kurt Smith saw it as, I think for the most part, pretty cool being in a rock band, and sort of he did his thing. But let's be clear, Roland was the principal songwriter, lyricist, did a lot of the production work for the records, although Ian Stanley got credit for it. He's a genius. Roland is a genius, and he has quite an interesting family background as well, which we don't have time to get into. But when Tears for Fears
not military, surely.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
But when they first came into my lexicon, it was the album, which is on our list and very high up on the list, Songs from the Big Chair, which, by the way, is the title is based upon that book. And I think it was a series on British television, or maybe it was American television, called Sybil, and it was about obviously that multiple personality disorder. And so when the album came out, that's when I first was aware of Tears for Fears, and you heard, the standard big hits from the album, and I thought, they're pretty simple and straightforward, but at least they're talking about shout, give yourself a voice, honesty, everyone wants to rule the world. And of course, what they were talking about is one's inner world, not the outer physical world. But when you looked into the other tracks on the album, holy cow, it made those singles seem like introductory based tracks to everything else. They're stunning compositions, absolutely stunning compositions by Roland Orzabal. And they're talking about some of the most important truths that exist, both down the rabbit hole about what the hell's going on, and then back up through a spiritual understanding of our reality. So the working hour, Mother's Talk, I Believe, holy smokes, folks, these are so important. I had so much fun writing this book because just getting right into the genius that is Roland Orzabal. And, it's funny because after Songs from the Big Chair, typically you would think that Tears for Fears had the world at their feet because there wasn't a better album that was released during the 80s. And they had a ton of hit singles and such. But for a variety of reasons, it took 4 years to release The Seeds of Love, and the album was very, very much about a spiritual journey, and it just didn't get any support. And that's a weird thing, isn't it? He's attacking Thatcher and the Conservative Party and just calling out the insanity of our reality. And this is from a band that, sold 10 million copies and had 4 massive hit singles on their previous record, and they just can't seem to find much support from the record label for an album called The Seeds of Love. And it really wasn't that long. And it's a great record. It's a great record. If you don't have The Seeds of Love, you need to add it to your record collection.
Well, I remember the single, Sowing the Seeds of Love. As I recall, that was a fairly big hit over here in the UK. And it had a bit of a psychedelic throwback element to it. It came right in the midst of that acid house era in the UK, which, of course, I've documented quite a bit in my most recent book, and I'm talking about the parallels between that and the first Summer of Love in the 60s. And we had this song from Tears for Fears coming out in 1989 that was right in the midst of the spirit of those times, and that appeared to be very much a throwback to 60s hippie ideals and stuff, and it was quite a standout record.
It was. It's an incredible song, and it's an incredible record. And it just did not get the support that the previous record did. And remember, here's a big thing for people to remember. The difference between 1985 and 1989 is 4 years of solidity for the music industry to have full control over their industry. And the number one way in which everything changed and why... Don't wait for it. We're never going to have a rebirth of great music again. We're not going to have any more of this classic rock. The best music in our history and all it's become is a genre. It's just called classic rock, CCR, Bruce Springsteen, it just sounds absurd. This is classic rock. No, that's incredible music. It defies terminology. They lump it as classic rock because they needed to kill great music. And that's what they've done. They've just turned everything into genres by owning the radio station. So 1985, 1989, 80% of all of the radio stations within the United States owned by a tiny group. 1989, 100% or virtually 100% being owned. And suddenly they are completely control of what gets played on the top 40. And
well, this is the thing. I mean, who can imagine us having this conversation in about 25 years' time? And we're talking about classic albums, and people are saying, right, the next one I want to talk about is Justin Bieber. Justin Bieber was imparting these incredible messages to humanity on this album. And then Nicki Minaj. Now, I just want to speak about the spiritual and metaphysical components to Nicki Minaj's music. And then somebody says, oh, I want to talk about Katy Perry and this Lady Gaga album. This Lady Gaga album, it has layers, man. It goes deep. She's imparting deep spiritual wisdom here. It's not going to happen. Those are just 4 names that I arbitrarily picked, but it's not going to happen with any names from today's music scene. We're not going to be waxing lyrical about these acts in 25 years' time, probably not even in 10 years' time, because this is not music that's built to last. It's temporary, it's factory line fodder, and it's by no means classic material that's going to stand the test of time and be talked about in decades to come, the way these albums are.
Wow, Mark, thank you for saying that. Man, that almost brought me to tears, how appropriate.
I think you probably feel the same way, right?
Yeah, because what you're saying is 100% truth. It's exactly what they're doing, and it's exactly why they're doing what they're doing. And by by telling us that we are just accidental creations of the Big Bang, just a random universe, and we're just a random fluke creation. Who cares about Earth, Wind, and Fire? And maybe they had some truth about our spirit. Who cares? It's all about Katy Perry. It's all about right now. It's all about fitting in. It's all about
and also they're using
bullshit.
they're using these artists now for agendas. So if they want to be pushing transhumanism or transgenderism, or they want artists rocking pizza imagery to tie in with Pizzagate, such as the sick, depraved nature of the individuals that run these industries, they'll use artists for that. They'll put Katy Perry in a video with dancing bits of pizza. They'll make Lady Gaga create a tune called Pizza. They'll put will.i.am in a video where he's dressed up as a cyborg because they want to glorify transhumanism. So they're just using these artists for these agendas at the time that it suits. And obviously they're going to make no sense in 10 years, 15 years, 25 years' time, because they were just for these temporary short periods of time, and it wasn't about artistic expression. It was about doing the bidding of the sick fucks that preside over these industries.
Exactly. And, let's just talk about this a little further here. Colleen was talking about this last night when we were preparing for your show today. And she was just talking about how the artists today, like the ones that you mentioned, there isn't a Maurice White, there are Bruce Springsteen, there isn't a Donald Fagen, Walter Becker, Frank Zappa in the bunch. There is no music. There's no Roland Orzabal.
None of them. No
genius. None of them. So, like you said, all of the stuff that they're doing is just fluff, and it won't last because it's fluff. But the thing that we're missing in all of this is that, do you literally think that there aren't more Roland Orzabals or more John Lennons or George Harrisons or Todd Rundgrens out there now? Joni Mitchells? There are.
I know that there are, because I put them in my Sound of Freedom podcast, and I dig out this stuff. But you're never going to hear these artists on the radio. You're never going to see them on TV rotation. They're never going to become household names. But you're right, they're out there. They're just being held back.
Exactly. So this is the thing that is so fucking scary about, if you only believe going forward in the physical realm, this thing is going to just, my podcast series that I you were a part of, and I just recently completed. Everything You Know Is a Lie, and Would You Like to Hear Some Truth?
Sure.
What they're doing with all of this is to get us to that Orwellian moment. We're already here. The end game is here, but we're getting us to that Orwellian moment where in the moment you realize that everything that we've accepted in this moment as the truth is a lie, and that it's so prevalent that there's nothing that you, the one enlightened person, can do. And so you just, Winston Smith, give up. You just try to find another lost soul to spend your few waking moments with before you hop back on the assembly line and be a cog in the wheel. And it is just such a sickening shame that we are headed to this reality where, like you said, 20 years from now, just talking about, Justin Bieber, and it's like, I don't really even remember him. Who is that?
Well, what it's going to be? What it's going to be is 20 years from now, people will still be talking about the same acts and albums that we are now. They'll be talking about the Beatles 70 years on instead of 50 years on. These same classic acts will get talked about forever, but nobody from this era will be.
That's right. But those classic albums won't be played, and slowly they'll be hunted down, ferreted out by the hit squad of the present or the future government, and anyone who has a copy of Abbey Road, well, you're on the hit list. So it's just sickening. It is absolutely sickening, because along with taking away the truth from us. They've taken away talent. They've taken away passion. They've taken away creativity. They've taken away holistic understanding. Genius artists that were giving us physical albums that were made largely through their non-physical spiritual experiences. That's powerful shit, man. And the result of hiding this truth by controlling the narrative is Justin Bieber. And we get what we deserve. We are complicit with this system, and that's sickening and sad beyond description. So thank you for having the courage to say that, Mark. It's brilliant.
Well, no worries, man. That's my mantra these days. I just express it in different ways. Let's move on to the next album and see if we can pull some uplifting, positive stuff out of the quagmire. Having ended on that note, we're talking about Joni Mitchell, The Hissing of Summer Lawns. What a great title. And of course, Joni Mitchell is one of so many artists who comes from a military family background, just to raise that dynamic again. I think her dad, she came out of Canada, I think her dad had something to do with the Air Force, and if I remember correctly, he was involved in training other pilots, despite the fact that he'd been deemed unfit for flying duty himself. I think he had impaired vision or something like that.
Yes,
so she came
exactly
out of right. She came out of that family. We're trying not to judge people by their family backgrounds, of course, on this show, as we mentioned earlier, and we're trying just to examine them as artists from an artistic point of view. So let's get into this album from '75, The Hissing of Summer Lawns.
Yeah, and let's just extend that narrative just a little further. Remember, and Joni did end up in Laurel Canyon, and not everyone who was in Laurel Canyon was an agent of the CIA, although that's conveniently where the CIA were located. But
well, they were drawn magnet-like to that place for some reason. They all ended up there, not by accident.
Yeah, if you want to hang around with David Crosby, and that's where Cros was, well, that's where he hung out. And it's obviously it was designed that way by the CIA, put some very key personnel there, and everybody else wanted to live there. We don't have time to get into all of it, but it's again painting fine detail with a roller. You can't do it. And not all these people are agents and shills. So regardless of where Joni Mitchell came from, the fact of the matter is she turned on the system, and she turned on the hand that potentially fed her. You have two realms to Joni Mitchell. You've got everything up to blue, and I think pretty much everybody knows that kind of singer-songwriter, acoustic. There's some piano, but acoustic and self-examination, confidential exposition of herself, all the way up to blue. And then for the roses, you had this dynamic change in Joni with massive growth in her understanding of chords, chord progressions, musical development. And then her lyrics changed from Court and Spark, which was still sort of personal examination, to more Steely Dan, which she talked about, that she was heavily influenced by the first two Steely Dan albums, Can't Buy a Thrill, Countdown to Ecstasy, and also by Frank Zappa, which were social satirists. They were basically talking about what was going on. So Joni, with The Hissing of Summer Lawns, changed not just with all of those luscious, complex, deliciously weird new chords that she discovered on Court and Spark, but now on The Hissing of Summer Lawns, she was satirizing the insanity of organized society. And that's why the title is Hissing of Summer Lawns. It can be taken in many, many ways, but obviously on a very singular, simple level, it is that constant sound within Bel Air. She was staying in David Geffen's house as a guest, and she treated it as basically an 18-month period or science experiment where she got to examine the other half of society up close.
You know, when I hear that title, The Hissing of Summer Lawns, it puts me in mind straight away of the opening to David Lynch's Blue Velvet movie.
Very
where
good. Yeah.
You have all these scenes of what appears to be perfect American family life, all these people in these lovely houses, everyone's happy and everyone's, it's all apple pie and good old American values. And then you see a sprinkler on this lawn and the camera pans in on the lawn in very close detail and you see the blades of grass, and then you go under the blades of grass and you see all these bugs running around, like all these garden insects and stuff, and he's supposedly showing you a glimpse of the underbelly of American society. When you strip away all the gloss and all the apparent perfection of Americana, you get into the ugly side of things, and then the rest of the film explores the dark side of human nature. I was just put in mind of that opening scene through the title of that album.
Oh, completely. It is the exact same thing. That's exactly what Joni did. The origin of the album comes from Africa, in the rhythms of the songs. They all and most exemplified in the track "The Jungle Line," but all of the basic rhythm and beats within each of the songs are very African in origin. And what she does is she ties the lyrical tale into that same motif as well, that essentially all that the great United States, which was just this heaven of consumerism, all the United States was the playground for extracting all of the resources from the so-called third world. And in this case, she was focusing upon Africa. And so in the songs, both musically and lyrically, Joni is talking about how this hidden group of powerful individuals are raping the third world and bringing all of these resources, including people, to the United States, into this paradise playground for runaway, rampant consumerism, for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is blind consumption. And just every single song, outside of the ending song where she goes into the truth of our reality, everything is shadows and light, all of these tales are all about this blind subservience to consumerism. Like Mike Williams was talking about with me, if it means that we have to bulldoze down the Amazon at 100 acres a day, then hey, no problem. Bulldoze the Amazon, because we got to have more of those iPhones. We got to have more Kraft dinner.
Right.
And that's what it's about. That's what the album is about. And as I say, it is a subversive masterpiece. When you talk about the most subversive albums of the 70s, and you're talking about Zappa, Steely Dan, Joni Mitchell's The Hissing of Summer Lawns is one of them, because if you just take a quick pass of the album, in France, The Kiss on Main Street was actually a hit single. Edith and the Kingpin was written in such a way that it got quite a bit of radio airplay. I mean, it's one of the best songs ever written. It's stunning. The title track got quite a bit of radio airplay. Harry's House got quite a bit of airplay. So on the surface, you might think, yeah, just another great Joni Mitchell album. None of the songs are bad. They're all great songs. And I don't really know what she was talking about, but it's a great album. But if you dig a little deeper, holy smokes, it is unveiling who these evil little male fucks are that are running this sick society, what their means are, and who are the victims. And we are the victims because we just blindly accept everything that they lay out in front of us. And that's what she's talking about in great detail. And every song is a different character. Every song is a little different aspect. It's a brilliant journey.
And there it was, 1975, and here we are, 43 years later. Not a whole lot has changed. Nothing new under the sun. But anyway, I just want to wrap up with a few observations. Before we do that, should we just squeeze in this Bowie album? We said we'd do it if we had time. Let's spend a quick 5 minutes on this. The one that we wanted to discuss was The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, 1972, a classic album on any level, by any standard. What did you most want to emphasize about this album?
Well, first off, from a songwriting standpoint, it was Bowie's best to that date. It showed him as a genius, really, as somebody with deep musical understandings, very, very disparate, divergent musical understandings, very smart fellow. And then lyrically, he took, a thematic topic and applied it to real world experiences that every kid could relate to. It is brilliant songwriting. It really was. And across the whole album. And it set the tone for everything. But, the thing that really, really overrides everything with Bowie is Bowie. And his sort of story, and we've talked about this a little before, but the thing that needs to be said about David Bowie is that he is someone that desperately wanted to be famous, and Bowie was willing to do what was necessary through his handler / wife, wasn't really his wife, but just handler for the music industry to take on certain personas, certain roles, to be the leading force in certain directions. So Space Oddity, you've got Major Tom, and floating in a tin can, and So Much Courage, and then there's Tragedy, and our hearts go out there to those astronauts
floating out there in outer space.
That's right, ready to go to the moon. So right off the bat, to become famous, that got him on the map. And so it's Space Oddity, and it's a great song, but it is what it is. And then
Mind Control to Major Tom.
No. Mind Control to Major Tom is so true.
Mind Control to Major Scam, maybe.
Yeah, it's so true, Mark. And the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars is, you tell us, what do you see when you look at the character of Ziggy Stardust? What is it? It's he says he's alien, but he's come to us in human form. He's sort of like a Christ-like figure. Was he man? Was he woman? He's man, and he likes other men, and there are just so many agendas, confusion going on with this creation of Ziggy Stardust. And it was so powerful for Bowie that it almost consumed him. And so, he left Britain, left London for the United States, and landed right in the heart of the devil, Los Angeles. And before you know it, there's a new Bowie, and it's the Thin White Duke. And this is the Thin White Duke that is just voraciously reading all this this deeply encoded esoteric stuff, light, dark, Aleister Crowley, getting into a much deeper understanding of it. And he became so freaked out that Bowie was just consuming copious amounts of cocaine day, night, to be able to just get him through these recording sessions, because he became so convinced that he was going to be taken out as a sacrifice, as per what he was reading through Aleister Crowley.
Well, I didn't know that.
And yeah, so this is sort of the David Bowie, and it goes all the way up to his 1980 album, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. And on that album, it's a great album. It's one of Bowie's fans' favorite, even though it didn't have like a ton of recognizable songs. It's because he was just so connected and so telling the truth, because it also represented the end of his original music contract. And Bowie was basically saying to himself and the industry that I'm out. You may have used me for all these different things. I'm out. And so that's why in the song you have this admission that he was Major Tom, and Major Tom was an addict, and he was an addict to fame and fortune, and that Major Tom had to die for David Bowie to be able to realize himself and move on. And that's when you got that new wave of Bowie that came afterwards with Let's Dance, Tonight, Never Let Me Down, and so on.
And then you've got a vision of a dead astronaut in his final video. You've got a vision of this astronaut lying dead on some remote planet or something, and he's got a smiley yellow face badge, interestingly, on the spacesuit, and that's presumed to be Major Tom. So he's come full circle in his career, and Major Tom has been killed off.
Yeah, really, like I say, it was in 1980 that with the song Ashes to Ashes that he killed him off. But with the video, it was a video symbology of what he had already done in 1980 on Ashes to Ashes. But yeah, so when it's very difficult for me to speak to Bowie just individually as this artist, this performer, this one album, because the man had such a powerful presence that really Bowie kind of haunts every single one of these records. But again, from a songwriting standpoint, it is a fabulous record, and it really showed Bowie on his previous 3 albums really getting everything together and really knocking one out of the park. I guess just the issue is, who is he knocking it out of the park for? Because these messages on Ziggy Stardust seem to fall right in place with what's going on right now with Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry, doesn't it?
Right. Well, he was an early pusher of androgyny, which could be taken to be an expression of the transgender agenda all those decades ago. The thing that strikes me from our conversation here, Charlie, is that digging around in record shops for old vinyl albums is an art form, and it's an aspect of culture. So you've got things like wine collection, for instance. So you have people with wine cellars, and they pay thousands of pounds or dollars for a vintage bottle of wine, and it's celebrated as high culture. And there's, a love of wine all around the world among connoisseurs. And then you have things like art galleries, fine paintings. People will pay similar sums for some great work of art. And when you think about it, vinyl albums and everything that goes into not just the music but the creation of the sleeve, all this amazing intricate artwork, and sometimes things like gatefold sleeves and other aspects of the actual physical record itself, picture discs and coloured vinyl, all that kind of thing. This is an art form, this is an aspect of culture, and this is one that's been affected by the onset of technology. So now people just prefer to download albums and grab them for free off the internet or stream them. Just don't see the point of streaming myself, versus physically owning a copy, and that just seems to be acceptable to so many people. And it's just such a danger that this beautiful art form of vinyl collection and cherishing and curating these wonderful pieces of art is largely being lost. I know there is still a scene out there. There are still vinyl connoisseurs. There are still some shops you can go to. There's record fairs and things like that. But it's an aspect of culture that I think really needs to be preserved, because once it goes, and it has been a beautiful thing all these decades. Again,
beautifully said, and so very true. And this is why every single one of the albums in the books, all 150 books on these 150 albums, they all start with the album artwork, because for these artists, they were all powerfully aware of the art form that they had in their midst. They knew they had an incredible opportunity to create a lasting impression with these legions of fans without ever getting to know them. And you know, Mark, they all talk about this. If you really find those rare interviews with those rare journalists where they felt comfortable and they were speaking from their heart, they all talked about that the album was a very precious creation, a very precious art form in which they were loaded with messages that were often deeply encoded, in the hopes that the listener again and again over years and years would come to fully resonate with, would come to fully understand. And what's the first thing they did? They took away the beautiful, lush, rich analog sound of the fat LP with those big record covers, and downsized it immediately into cold, digital, horrible sounding, robotic CDs. And the album covers were still there, but now they're a fraction of the size, and you can barely see anything. And so much of what was on the original album was not included on the DVD copies that came along. So they had the cover, but they have a new back. It wasn't the same back. There's no inner gatefold. There's no album sleeves with the lyrics or special messages. It's all taken away. And there's a reason, because they knew that these kids were getting powerful messages out. They knew how important that the album was and is, and that's why they've been trying to kill it. And this is why you have this reality that you spoke to, which is streaming. So that now the only way that all of these classic artists, such as, you know, John Fogerty or whomever, can make a living is to constantly just be on the road, to constantly tour, because there is no such thing as a back catalog anymore. No one's buying albums. They're not available anymore. And now these artists are only getting paid, and the last one to convert over was iTunes. And iTunes now is going to take away access to purchasing the albums, and all that you can do is just buy this music through streams. And it's a collection of 500 songs or 5,000 songs that you get access to for 30 days, and then that's it. And so your song
man.
Exactly. And a song gets played 4 times in a month, and the artist makes 32 cents, and that's going to pay their rent or mortgage. It's just,
and they wonder why people download illegally, so that they can at least own a copy, even if it is an MP3.
Yep. Just think of all of the DVDs that you ever bought or CDs you ever bought. Most of them don't work anymore, whether they're scratched or you just don't know why they don't work. It's such a scam. It's such constant disrespect, outright hatred for the masses on part of these people who are running the show behind the scenes.
Right.
And I'm so thankful that you know you've taken interest in my books and this series, because they are so important. These albums are so important because it is, like you said, art at its highest form, and it's being stolen from us. That's what they do. They rape everything for themselves, take it away, hide it like it never existed, and then replace it with something else, and that becomes our reality.
Right. Yeah, I can't imagine how many hours you put into this series, man. That's like 150 essays in great detail. Must have been a labour of love over many years. So just remind people where they can go to get hold of this whole series and what format it's available in, and are you going to be doing updates to it? Are you going to be adding any volumes to the list?
Well, where we are right now is all 150 books, and they are books. They all range from 3 to 450 pages, so they're pretty big. And all 150 books are written. Now, there are 6 that are available in both ebook and paperback formats. And what Colleen and I decided to do was stop there and to develop the Freek's, Charlie Freek, Freak Sense TV, YouTube channel, and all the other things that we're doing to help create a greater awareness to the author Charlie Freek, which just happens to be me, and this book series. Because when they were first released, there's no history of myself as Charlie Freek. There's no history of me as an author. And there's essentially virtually no one outside of yourself initially that was even taking an interest in these books. It's very weird, but it's interesting because the books seem to antagonize the truth movement, this supposed truth movement, because there's been this deep revelation about how controlled all these various industries are and have been. So there's.
I think I'm a bit guilty of that myself, aren't I?
Yeah.
Just
no. Because you always do a holistic approach to everything, and so it's wonderful. It's good. It's the truth, so it's wonderful. The truth is never bad. It's always good. And then from the standard, lost in the system music fans, they just aren't prepared to hear the things that I'm writing about. Bruce Springsteen fans don't really want to hear how spiritual Bruce Springsteen really is as a person. So the books, when they first got started, kind of fell in that no man's land between two worlds. The blind society that just absorbs whatever they're told, and then the truth movement that has a suspicious eye to all of these albums and artists. Right. So they have continued to sell and do fairly well. But really, these books are, and I will take the time to say this, that these books are so well done, they are so well written, and they are literally so important that this is why we've taken the time to create an awareness of who Charlie Freek is, what he stands for, Freak Sense TV, and generate all this information. And then sometime in the coming months, I'm going to get back to the remaining 144 books that are finished, and now I just go through, and it takes about a week to edit and then convert them into both ebook and then paperback formats, and then just release that information. But if nobody knows who you are, then you're just constantly releasing what I honestly am saying, great book after great book to an audience of 11, and that's not really doing any service to the books and the information. Right. I don't really care about myself or any relative awareness or fame for myself, but the information, these albums and the information contained in these books, therefore the books, is so important. They're so well done, and they deserve a large audience. So we're going to just keep doing what we're doing, and like I say, I'm going to slowly get back out and just release all 150. All the books that are available for sale right now and will be in the future are available at lulu.com. And all you have to do when you go to lulu.com is just type in author Charlie Freek, or you can go to lulu.com spotlight Charlie Freek 1, and that takes you to my authors page. and it shows everything that has been released in all formats, and you can purchase it. Plus, there's also really lengthy free previews from each book, and I just recommend read them because they're great. They're great, and it gives you a whole flavor for what the books are like. So, coming soon, I am going to release a trilogy of Supertramp albums, and that's going to be Crime of the Century, Even in the Quietest Moments, and Breakfast in America. And I'm going to make a little exception and get those 3 out in the next couple of weeks. Thanks, man, and have a great night.
Catch you soon.
This is just for I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up